It began with dust-fine, gray, clinging dust, choking the breath from men who had already accepted their death. In the labyrinthine tunnels beneath Halar, Japanese soldiers sat in silence, their hands trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion, from hunger, from hopeless resolve. Their ammunition was gone, their bayonets loose in tired hands. The rumble above told them everything. The Red Army had come, and nothing could stop it. But they rose anyway. They would hurl themselves at Soviet tanks with bare hands, explosives strapped to their bodies. They would die, knowing their sacrifice would buy Halar one more hour, perhaps one more day. Madness? Maybe. But such was the final stand of a dying empire. And yet, why do we not remember it? Why is this colossal campaign, the largest and fastest military offensive of the 20th century, barely mentioned in Western textbooks? How could over 1.5 million Soviet soldiers launch a three-pronged blitzkrieg through mountains, deserts, and cities, crushing the once feared Kwantung Army, and still remain a historical footnote? More importantly, did this forgotten Soviet invasion, not the atomic bombs, truly force Japan to surrender? In this episode of Legacy Files, we descend into the shadows of a campaign deliberately overshadowed, strategically veiled, and morally complex. A campaign that reshaped the destiny of East Asia and lit the first sparks of the Cold War. To understand the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945, one must first rewind to the early embers of imperial ambition in East Asia. In 1905, the Russian Empire suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of a rising power, Japan, during the Russo-Japanese War. That war concluded with the Treaty of Portsmouth, which saw Russia lose Port Arthur, the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and its dominant position in Manchuria. For Tsarist Russia, it was a wound to the national psyche, a blow to its imperial confidence. For Japan, it was a signal. The age of Asian dominance had begun. Fast forward to 1931. Japan invaded Manchuria again, this time not from Russia, but from its Korean colony. The puppet state of Manchukuo was born, ruled on paper by the last Qing Emperor Puyi, but in reality, governed with an iron fist by the Japanese Kwantung Army. The region became a staging ground for Japan's broader conquests in China. Stalin watched warily. Through the 1930s, the USSR and Imperial Japan engaged in a tense, often bloody standoff along the borderlands of Mongolia and Manchuria. Skirmishes became routine. In 1939, a full-scale battle erupted at Khalkhin Gol, where Soviet General Georgy Zhukov decisively defeated a Japanese force using tanks and air power. It was a humiliating loss for Japan, one that redirected its gaze away from Siberia and toward the Pacific. For a time, a kind of sinister balance was struck. In 1941, just before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Moscow and Tokyo signed a neutrality pact. Stalin could now focus westward. Japan, in turn, concentrated on expanding south and east, attacking Pearl Harbor in December. For nearly 4 years, the USSR honored the neutrality agreement, but it did not forget. As early as 1943, Stalin had made quiet promises to the Western Allies. At the Tehran Conference, he pledged to enter the war against Japan once Hitler was defeated. At Yalta in February 1945, he reiterated that promise and demanded concessions. The return of Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and rights in Manchuria previously lost in 1905. President Roosevelt agreed, as did Churchill. By the time Nazi Germany collapsed in May 1945, the Red Army was already shifting east. Operation August Storm had begun quietly. The man tasked with planning the offensive was Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, one of the Soviet Union's most competent strategists. He had overseen the final stages of the war in Europe. Now, Stalin charged him with crushing the Kwantung Army in a matter of weeks. But there was a catch. Manchuria was not Normandy. It was a rugged, mountainous infrastructure, starved region larger than Western Europe. Japanese defenders numbered around 800,000, possibly more with reserves, and the Red Army had to strike through deserts, rivers, and ridges to destroy them. Logistics were nightmarish. Supplies, fuel, ammunition had to travel thousands of kilometers from the Soviet heartland, largely via the Trans-Siberian Railway. Yet by August, over 1.5 million Soviet troops had assembled, drawn from veterans of the European Front and Siberian reserves. They brought with them more than 5,000 tanks, 3,700 aircraft, and 26,000 artillery pieces. The attack date was set, August 9. Then, on August 6, the world changed. Hiroshima vanished beneath a mushroom cloud. 3 days later, the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. But by then, the Red Army was already moving. At precisely midnight on August 9, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. 1 hour later, all 3 Soviet fronts thundered into Manchuria. To the Japanese High Command, the Soviet betrayal was as devastating as it was unexpected. Despite growing concerns that the USSR might intervene, many in Tokyo clung to a desperate hope that Stalin could mediate a negotiated surrender to the Western Allies. Several Japanese diplomats had even approached Moscow in July, hoping to use the Neutrality Pact as a diplomatic channel. But Stalin was not interested in peace. He was interested in power. He wanted leverage in post-war Asia. He wanted Port Arthur back and rail rights in Manchuria. He wanted control over Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, and perhaps if the Red Army moved fast enough, say, in the occupation of Japan itself. Above all, he wanted revenge. The plan Vasilevsky devised was nothing short of audacious. Instead of attacking along traditional lines, Soviet forces would launch a vast pincer movement, converging from the west, north, and east. From the Transbaikal front, troops pushed through the greater Khingan Mountains terrain the Japanese considered impassable. From the first Far Eastern Front, Soviet and Mongolian cavalry poured through the Gobi Desert and crossed into Inner Mongolia. From the second Far Eastern Front, divisions surged across the Ushiri River, tying down Japanese troops along the eastern edge of Manchuria and Korea. The goal was complete envelopment, no retreat, no regrouping. Japanese resistance, though spirited, was uneven. The Kwantung Army had once been one of the most elite fighting forces in Asia. But by 1945, it had been stripped of its best divisions in south to defend Pacific Islands. What remained were poorly trained recruits, garrison troops, and local auxiliaries. Many units had little armor or air support. Ammunition was short. Morale was worse. Yet some resisted fanatically. At Halar, Japanese defenders transformed underground tunnel networks into fortress cities. Suicide bombers flung themselves at Soviet tanks. In Mutanxiang, one of the few full-scale battles of the campaign, 55,000 Japanese troops held off nearly 300,000 Soviets for several days, inflicting heavy casualties before being overrun. But these were exceptions. Most units, upon seeing the scale and speed of the Soviet advance, simply collapsed or surrendered. By August 14, the Red Army had reached the outskirts of Changchun, the capital of Manchukuo. Soviet Marines stormed into northern Korea, seizing Chongjin. On Sakhalin Island, bloody amphibious assaults raged as Soviet troops pushed toward Japanese strongholds. Then came August 15. From a radio studio in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito made his first ever address to the Japanese people. In formal, archaic language, he announced Japan's surrender not because of atomic bombs, but because of a new and most cruel bomb that threatened the very survival of mankind. The statement was vague. No formal orders were issued to field commanders. In Manchuria, confusion reigned. Some Japanese units laid down arms immediately. Others fought on, believing the message a ruse. At Karafuto, 20,000 Japanese defenders rejected surrender orders and fought to the death. At Halar, the siege dragged on for another 4 days before the final garrison surrendered. But for Stalin, none of this mattered. Every hour counted. Soviet forces continued to push until August 20, capturing Harbin, Chichihar, and dozens of smaller cities. In the ruins of Harbin, they discovered Unit 731, Japan's infamous biological warfare division, attempting to burn evidence of its grotesque experiments. By August 20, just 11 days after the Soviet invasion began, Manchuria had fallen. Entire Japanese formations were disarmed. Cities surrendered without a fight. Supply depots were seized intact. Soviet tanks rolled through villages where stunned locals, Chinese, Koreans, Mongolians looked on with a mixture of relief, terror, and uncertainty. But the consequences of this blitzkrieg were only beginning. In total, the Red Army advanced over 600 kilometers in less than 3 weeks across mountain ridges, through desert basins, over river valleys. Over 2.7 million Japanese military personnel and civilians were captured in the operation. Of these, an estimated 600,000 were sent to labor camps in Siberia and would never return. On paper, Soviet casualties were light, around 24,000 killed or wounded. But this figure masks the staggering logistical and physical strain placed on Soviet units, who endured one of the most ambitious military operations in modern history without any real preparation time. Their reward was not rest, but occupation. Marshal Vasilevsky's performance in Manchuria earned him the title Hero of the Soviet Union. His plan, executed with clockwork precision, had crushed the last major Japanese army in Asia. Stalin was pleased. The campaign gave him control over Manchuria, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands, all critical territories for Soviet ambitions in East Asia. But the victory was not purely territorial. It was psychological. In Japan, the rapid fall of Manchuria shattered the last illusions held by the military clique ruling in Tokyo. The atomic bombs had shown that Japan could be destroyed from the sky. The Soviet invasion proved it could be dismantled on the ground. Despite this, many Western narratives continue to emphasize Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the decisive moments in Japan's surrender. Yet, internal Japanese records tell a more nuanced story. On August 8, the day before the Soviet invasion, Japan's Supreme War Council remained divided on surrender. The majority wished to continue fighting, hoping to broker better terms. But after the USSR entered the war, Prime Minister Suzuki is reported to have said, "Now the game is up." Emperor Hirohito, too, cited the new situation in the East as a reason for surrender. His concern was not just the atomic bomb, but the prospect of Soviet troops landing in Hokkaido, dividing Japan as Germany had been divided. The Japanese people, meanwhile, were stunned. For decades they had been told their army was invincible, their empire eternal. Now, it had crumbled in a matter of days. The Soviets were not just victorious, they were fast, brutal, and unrelenting. And then came the silence. As Soviet troops settled into occupation zones in Manchuria and Korea, reports emerged of widespread looting, rape, and violence, particularly in cities like Harbin, where chaos followed the collapse of Japanese authority. The Red Army, hardened by years of brutal war in Europe, brought that same ruthlessness eastward. Chinese civilians, long brutalized by Japanese rule, sometimes welcomed the Soviets, but many soon realized they were exchanging one overlord for another. Stalin quickly began arming Chinese communist forces under Mao Zedong, tipping the balance of the Chinese Civil War and laying the groundwork for a divided Asia. Meanwhile, in Korea, the Soviet presence in the north led directly to the establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's Hermit Kingdom of Kim Il-sung, founded with Moscow's backing. The division of Korea into North and South, once seen as temporary, would become permanent, leading to a war of its own in 1950. In Tokyo, U.S. officials watched with alarm as the Red Army approached the Tsushima Strait. American occupation forces were racing to disarm Japanese troops before the Soviets could gain a foothold on the main islands. Stalin had hoped to carve out a zone of influence in Hokkaido, just as he had in Berlin, but General Douglas MacArthur, backed by the might of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, moved swiftly to prevent any Soviet landing. By the end of September, the Soviet advance had halted, but the Cold War had already begun. Today, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria remains a strange ghost in the historical record, overshadowed by the blinding flash of Hiroshima, drowned out by the drama of Tokyo Bay, ignored in Western classrooms. And yet, what if the Red Army had not attacked? Would Japan still have surrendered in August 1945? Would the bombs alone have been enough? Or would the war have dragged on, costing hundreds of thousands more lives? More provocatively, was Stalin's Blitzkrieg timed not just to defeat Japan, but to frighten America? To send a message to Truman, we can crush empires too? The answer is murky. What is clear is this: the collapse of the Kwantung Army marked the end of Japan's imperial dream and the beginning of Asia's Cold War nightmare. In the ashes of Manchuria rose the People's Republic of China. In the ruins of Korea, two bitter rivals were born. And far to the north, Stalin stood triumphantous, ambitions fulfilled, his enemies scattered, his silence loud. And the men in the tunnels of Halar? They were never coming home, but for a brief, terrible moment, they held the line between an empire that was dying and a world being born from fire. If this story resonates with you, if history's forgotten battles, buried truths, and untold legacies matter, subscribe to Legacy Files. We bring the shadows into light,